We're going to be continuing our series on spiritual disciplines. Again, you can call it practice if you want, rather than discipline. Spiritual practices. And just to give you a heads up, we'll be looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 5, and we'll also be looking at Matthew chapter 4. The reason we're doing this is not because we want to become monks or nuns, although if that God calls you to that, then go for it. It's interesting how the history of spiritual disciplines has shifted over time, like the history of anything. There was a time where the early followers of Christ would carry out these disciplines, would follow these practices. They were fairly normal at the time for many people in pursuing a faith. But what seems to have happened is that things have become a bit narrower, and they started to get overcomplicated, and more rules were introduced, and they became the pursuit of what many would see as the spiritual elite. I mean, we can think of monks and nuns, for instance, and it seemed that the spiritual disciplines were a pursuit reserved for people like that who had more time on their hands than the rest of us. And actually, that has been a great weakness, a great poverty for the church as a whole. Not monastic movements as a whole, but the idea that pursuing spiritual disciplines is reserved for people like that. That, in my opinion, is a great poverty. And that's why we're looking at this series now, not because we want to, just single a few people out and create spiritual superhumans, but that actually we want all of us to be sustained and fulfilled as followers of Christ. And if Jesus did these things to be sustained and to be fulfilled, then as his followers, we need to look closely, not just at these practices, but also at ourselves and say, what needs changing in order for me to pursue this challenge of discipleship. We need to be formed, do you remember I said last week, by the potter's hand. That's what spiritual disciplines allow us to do, to place ourselves in the care and the attention of the potter. Practices like fasting and practices like prayer. Now, some disciplines or practices are disciplines of engagement. We engage with God. We do something. We take up a good habit. So think about the disciplines of prayer. That's a discipline of engagement where we engage with God. Think about the discipline of worship, which in itself is a discipline. Again, we engage with God. Studying the Word, we engage with God through his Word. So those are disciplines of engagement. Others are disciplines of abstinence, of abstaining, of not doing something or taking something out of our lives for a short period of time, sometimes for a longer period, in order to pursue discipleship. So we abstain from certain things or desires like food or luxuries or words or sex. There may be nothing wrong with these things or these desires. They may be God-given, but they can be distorted by fallen humanity, and they can cause us to sin. And so a legitimate, wholesome desire can become a cause for us to fall. Dallas Willard says that true spiritual discipline allows us to single out those tendencies that may harm our walk with God. They allow us then to submit those desires and those things to the authority of the kingdom of God. For them to be disciplines, they need to be regular. They need to be planned and pursued even when we don't feel like it. When I was a ministerial student at Bible College in Cardiff, we would go on a retreat to Llangasty Retreat House on the shores of Llangors Lake near Brecon. I loved it, despite the early start, because I was based in Kerry and I'd drive all the way down there and we'd get there quite early, and it just felt like a really early start for me. It was in January, so it was always cold, and there may have been snow as well. And it gave us an opportunity to find some peace and reflection at the start of the year. And my favourite times on those retreats were often when I was alone. You would have a period of time on your own. You see, I have no issue with solitude. I know some people find it hard. I love it. I find it really easy. The challenge with solitude is finding the time. But for me personally, it's just how I'm made. I find solitude very easy, although I know not everyone will find it so easy. The other students also appreciated the retreat, though it was not always so. My first year at Llangasti, the second and third years, students in hushed tones told me of the time when the annual ministerial student retreat fell silent. It was literally a silent retreat. From the time they got there to the time they left, most of it was in silence. And it was torture, so they told me. They found it so difficult. And they told me about the fact that instead of sneaking out for a quick cigarette break or a tot of whiskey, not that ministerial students should ever have done that, they instead snuck out for a quick chat break. Away from the retreat leader, hoping the retreat leader wouldn't catch them. I think they'd be more embarrassed to be caught talking than to be caught smoking. In all my time as a student, the silent retreat never did reappear. They must have found it so difficult. How would we cope on such a retreat? Would it be torture for us to be sitting at the meal table with friends, with church family, with brothers and sisters, and not speak? Would it be worth it? What could we possibly gain? I know some of you are thinking paradise, and others are thinking the opposite. Are solitude and silence worth the pain? So to scripture, before we continue. Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Ecclesiastes was the book that I did my dissertation on as a ministerial student. It's an incredible book because so often it speaks out of the real turmoil of life. So this is Ecclesiastes chapter 5. We're just going to read the first 7 verses. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Go near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools who do not know that they do wrong. Do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty with your heart to utter anything before God. God is in heaven and you are on earth, and so let your words be few. A dream comes when there are many cares, and many words mark the speech of a fool. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to fulfill it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. It is better not to make a vow than to make one and not fulfill it. Do not let your mouth lead you into sin, and do not protest to the temple messenger, my vow was a mistake. Why should God be angry at what you say and destroy the work of your hands? Much dreaming and many words are meaningless. Therefore, fear God. And now to Matthew chapter 4. And we'll just read the first 11 verses. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting for 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city, set him at the highest point of the temple. If you are the Son of God, he said, throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. Jesus answered, it is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give to you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Then the devil left him, and the angels came and attended him. The same question. Are solitude and silence worth the pain? Well, Jesus obviously thought so. Before he began his earthly ministry, he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness and he fasted. Not just from food, but from company. He was on his own for 40 days, some scriptures say, with the wild animals. He deprived himself from the joy of human company for 40 days. In solitude. And it wasn't just a one-off. Before choosing his first disciples, what did Jesus do? He spent the night out on a mountain alone, in solitude, in prayer with God. When he heard about the death of John the Baptist, his relative, he withdrew by boat to a deserted place by himself. And he also encouraged his followers to do the same thing. After they'd had a busy schedule of teaching and ministry, they told Jesus all they had done. And Jesus said to them, great, do some more? No, he didn't. Thankfully, Jesus had wiser words for them. After their busyness and their serving of God, Jesus said to them, come away to a deserted place, all by yourselves, and rest a while. So just in those examples, we find that before busy times, after busy times, and in the midst of busy times, Jesus pursued solitude and silence. The two go hand in hand. And while you can have one without the other, we're dealing with both today because they are so closely entwined. Solitude and silence. But why? Why should we isolate ourselves? Haven't we had enough of that these last 2 years? Why do we need any more? Well, there are many of us who, even when isolating, weren't isolated. I want to give you some reasons. And let's think about solitude for one. Solitude frees us from the natural interactions of our world and our relationships. It makes us available to our Creator in a way that being with other people cannot. Solitude is not escapism, but it is a pursuit of who God is, without many of the distractions that normal life can bring. Solitude means that we cannot be encouraged and built up by others in solitude. We don't depend on others for our well-being or for our value. When we're feeling a bit down, we can't get a comment from somebody saying, don't worry, you're doing okay, because we're in solitude. We aren't trying to achieve anything for anyone to see or please anyone, because there's nobody there to please. Instead, we're learning to rest in the arms of our Creator. It's worth distinguishing this morning that solitude is not the same as loneliness. There are folk who long for human company, who experience deep loneliness. We all need human interaction. We need each other. So solitude is not loneliness. But what solitude does is take us into a place where it is simply us and our Creator, and perhaps for many of us, including me, our creation. It is a deliberate rejection of the world's values of finding our worth in others or finding our worth in what we're doing so that others can see and tell us how valuable we are. It's the opposite of scrolling through a social media feed, finding out what's happening in the world or seeing how many people have responded to your post. Solitude can be incredibly disconcerting for many people to spend time alone because it can be revealing. You're left with yourself and God. And yet I would say it is vital for the follower of Jesus to be able to dwell a while in solitude. If Jesus needed it, how much more do we? Now to silence. Silence closely follows solitude. And it's sadly lacking in our world. Do you remember the challenging days of early lockdown where literally we couldn't see anybody? We were locked down. And we responded as a church, and the first thing we started to do was record, well, at least I recorded some services. We weren't having live online services at that point, we were recording them. And I recorded the odd reflection from the garden. And you know what? It was so quiet. It was so quiet that creation was so loud. I could hear I would record myself and I was like, how loud is that blackbird? How loud is... It was just incredible. You know, that first lockdown, there were sound engineers going out and recording the sound of the dawn because they could actually record it without the sound of cars passing by. You know, it was a sound engineer's field, you know, they just loved it. And I know many people were measuring the volume and noticing how the volume had dropped and the wildlife seemed to get louder. But it's not always like that. We're kind of back to normal now. I can hear the bypass. If I was doing recording in the garden, there'd be a slight sound of the bypass, although I must admit, where we live is paradise and we can hear the birds. But the point is that silence is sadly lacking in our world. When the sounds of humanity are stilled and are hushed, other voices can be heard. For me, it was the blackbirds, it was the birds singing, but perhaps there are even more important voices to hear. When the sound of our own voice is stilled, we are able to listen more. You know, I was reflecting upon this as I was writing and how few sermons, as in zero, that I've heard about silence and solitude, and yet it's there in Scripture. I think I was talking to Nigel and recognising that while people had mentioned it in sermons, it was never the focus. It was always just a little side issue. And I also reflected as I was writing this, how many evangelism or outreach courses and training, very good things to do, by the way, teach us what to say, how to speak to others, and how many teach us how to listen. I recognise that. How many teach us what to say, how many teach us how to listen. There is a time to keep silence and a time to speak, so the writer of Ecclesiastes tells us. And I think of Jesus and his interactions with folk, his meetings up with them, his discussions with them. Think of the woman at the well, or Nicodemus, or Zacchaeus. It wasn't necessarily everything he said that changed that situation. It was how he listened. And he didn't just listen to their words, because sometimes what people are saying is at this level. He listened to their souls because their souls were saying something different. He really listened Deep down, he heard what their voices didn't tell him. And I think part of that is because he knew how to be silent. 40 days of silence before his ministry began. We're lucky if we get 10, 15 minutes, half an hour, who knows? 40 days. Silence is a teacher. It teaches us that our words are not the most important thing. It teaches us that if we truly valued our words, we would make them count. I remember our college principal, and he was not a verbose man. He wouldn't, elaborate and speak and preach for ages. And when we had one-on-one tutorials, he was very quiet. He was very reflective. But when he said something, it mattered. And he was one of these people that could tell you off in such a way that you don't realize you're being told off until you leave the office and you're thinking, I think he might have told me off there. He was so gentle, so gentle. And I'm gonna go out on a limb and think that man has probably experienced silence as a discipline because of the way he could listen. But how much more so in terms of making our words count than when we come to our Father in heaven? As the writer of Ecclesiastes wrote, and we heard it this morning, do not be quick with your mouth. And I love these words where he says, go near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools. I don't think he's saying you should never speak to God. I don't think he's saying that actually when you pour out your hearts to God, you're being a fool. But I do think that he's probably witnessed many people coming to the temple and dominating with their words when they should really be listening. Friends, I don't want to scare you into not saying anything for fear of offending God or humankind. That's not the point. As the writer of Ecclesiastes says, there's a time to keep silence and a time to speak. But silence is an essential teacher for the disciple of Christ. And in all honesty, some church traditions do it a lot better than the church traditions I've grown up in. So how do we learn from solitude and silence? Well, we need to seek them out. It's not something that will happen naturally for most people. So I'm just going to give you some practical suggestions. And when I send out the study notes to the folk who've asked for them, I'll try and put a bit more detail. But again, they're just suggestions. They may not work for you, but they may help. How about this? In your regular prayer time, introduce a time of silence, of stillness, where you keep quiet, where you don't have to speak. It could be you need to set a timer because it's so hard. It could be for some of you, it's paradise, but for some, it may be difficult. So think about setting a timer or checking the watch so that you give a period of silence where you don't expect to get anything in return other than being silent in God's presence. And he may speak to you and he may not, but that silence is the goal. Perhaps you can set aside an hour or half a day or even a full day where you will go away and be alone. Switch off your phone, your TV, you go somewhere where you will not be disturbed. If you're one of these people who find silence difficult, you've got to have some background noise, then maybe you should start with just an hour rather than a whole day and then work up. And in that time, it helps to have some kind of structure. So set yourself some simple goals. Now, I don't know what Jesus did in those 40 days. I really don't. I can guess, but that would be just an exercise in imagination. But for us, I think if we set ourselves time, we have some goals. Perhaps you need to organise your life priorities. Instead of working them out on your own, spend time listening to God in solitude and in silence, or simply being in his presence. Perhaps you need to seek for an answer from God. And while the Bible says we should ask, how about you set some time where you listen for the answer? not just at the end of the big ask, but set yourself time. In fact, why not try a habit of spending more time listening for an answer than asking? Now and then, that would be a wonderful thing to do. And this is a challenge, again, just for some of us perhaps. In a meeting or a discussion group, if you would normally dive in and say something, if you feel you have something to share, wait just a little bit longer. Try a habit of waiting, even if you just know, because it's something, you've got this wonderful story to share and you know it will benefit people. Get into the habit of taking a little step back and waiting. And you may find that you still need to speak, and what you say it will be valuable and really helpful. But it also could be perhaps you were supposed to listen and hold back from speaking. Don't be afraid of silence. Another thing is, don't be afraid of it. In prayer meetings, in Bible studies, silence doesn't mean you've failed. It could simply mean everyone's listening at the same time. That's not a bad thing to get into the habit of doing. Something in the future I'd like to do is look at some church retreats, maybe not a whole day of silence, but perhaps a church retreat that incorporates silence and reflection for people who would want to pursue that. I mean, I could talk about my practice, but one of the reasons I haven't is because I recognise I'm in a very privileged position, that I'm able to structure my working week, for most parts, around a spiritual practice. And I'm trying to do that rather than structure my spiritual practice around what the week of work is. So I'm in a privileged position that I know not everyone is. So it may not be helpful for me to go on about, the wonders of these hours of solitude or the time of study. If you want to talk to me about it afterwards, I'll share my practice with you. But the important thing this morning is recognizing that there is a place in our lives, however busy they may be, for silence and for solitude. And more than that, there is a need as a disciple of Christ. Do you know, as I began to prepare this message this morning, and there's an awful lot more to say, but as I began to prepare it, the irony was not lost on me that I've spent the last half hour using many words in the company of many people to encourage us to pursue the absence of words and the absence of people. So I'll try not to go on much longer. As one who finds solitude easy, I must say that I find such peace and such confidence in my Creator by resting in His presence through being silent and through being in solitude. And I see why Jesus would do so. I can see personally why the Son of God sought out lonely places. For me, creation is a place I love to be alone in. And Jesus sought the wilderness, and God's people often were sent into the wilderness for times of testing or times of reflection. And our fears, for me as well, our fears are put into perspective by the simple peace of the created world and dwelling in the presence of our Creator. I want to read to you a poem by a man called Wendell Berry. He's a Christian who wrote many, many poems, wrote many stories. And this poem doesn't mention God, but for me, it's shot through with the idea of God being always present, being always there, and that we just need to learn sometimes to listen. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world and am free. It's a very simple poem that he entitles The Peace of Wild Things. And whether it is the peace of God you find in the wilderness, in the wild things, or the peace of God you find in a cloister, or the peace of God you find in your room, the one thing I'm certain of is he is waiting for you.